What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We got a brand new guest in the library this week, author Eric T. Chester, who just published in August his new book called Free Speech and the Suppression of Dissent During World War I from Monthly Review Press, which we are big fans of here on the show. We are very honored to have Eric join us to talk through his book. We're going to talk about all sorts of different topics, such as the different contexts of suppression of free speech in the UK and the US around World War I. We're going to talk about Eugene Debs, the IWW, Samuel Gompers, and the ALF-CIO, some legendary, incredible IWW strikes and labor drives during the period, and all sorts of other good stuff. And we're going to really focus on how Eric's work relates to understanding the context of free speech, the Bill of Rights, in our own current political context, and how power operates. This is one of many books that Eric has published, and if you're interested to check out a few others, some ones that he would definitely like to recommend are his book, The Wobblies in Their Heyday, The Rise and Destruction of the Industrial Workers of the World During the World War I Era, and Yours for Industrial Freedom, The Industrial Workers of the World from the Inside. And you can find both of those from Levelers Press. One additional note from yours truly, Chairman Bain, I have just recently published the third and final installment of my very long-term writing project over the last 6 to 7 months on dialectical pessimist subjectivity. That is called On These Excremental Selves, Subjectivity and the Dialectical Pessimist Key, on my Capillaries Theory at the Front blog, which hopefully those proto-book chapters are going to be turned into a very, very exciting new book project coming your way. Hopefully soon. Fingers crossed. We're going to jump right into the episode, but let's run down our typical housekeeping items on ways you can support Red Library and the work that we're doing week in and week out on the show. If you'd like to become a patron for as little as $1 per month, that is less than a quarter per episode, head on over to patreon.com. That's www.patreon.com/Red Library Podcast, and you can find us there. You can also find a link to our Patreon page and all of our other social media platforms and such down in the show notes. Remember, by becoming a patron, you get access to our Discord server, which is full of the discourse, book groups, roundtables, movie nights. And don't be surprised if you join in on there and you bring up a particular topic or suggest a book for someone to check out, I will likely ask you to do an episode. Follow us on Twitter, like the show on Facebook. Remember, if you're listening on iTunes, please go down, give us one of those star reviews. Those are really helping us get into more and more ears, minds, hearts, third eyes of listeners, potential comrades all over the globe. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons Podcasting Network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our podrads over at The Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. One last thing before we dive in. If you enjoyed our 2-part episode with C. Derek Varn, I think this is going to be a perfect complement of just straight up history from that lost context, that lost historical moment of World War I. So apparently, history is the theme of October. But don't worry, we have some theoretical missiles, some psychoanalytic cluster bombs geared up for November, coming your way very soon. Here we go, y'all. It's me, Comrade Adam / Chairman Bain, and Eric T. Chester on free speech and the suppression of dissent during World War I. Enjoy. Well, hello everyone. This is Comrade Adam, and I am here with a very, very special new guest in the Red Library. So I will let him introduce himself, and just so you know, Eric, everyone on the show is Comrade, so I hope you don't mind if I'm going to call you Comrade Eric throughout the recording today.
I've been in socialist politics for a long time, so I'm used to being called Comrade.
Very familiar. Excellent. So yeah, but please tell everyone about yourself and sort of what we're going to be talking about today and this excellent new book of yours that's coming out.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Eric Chester, and so I've been involved in socialist politics since the 60s in a variety of different organizations, including the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, and the Socialist Party, both of which I've done research into. And I taught for a while, economics, actually, and various other things. And then I started writing. So this is actually my 7th book.
Oh, wow.
I get to show it? Huh?
Yeah. It's a great cover, too.
It's my 7th book and published by Monthly Review. And yeah, it looks at the question of free speech during the First World War and the kind of debates that came around that, debates that are still very, very relevant, very salient to what's going on now. I guess to set the context, the First World War was very unpopular to start with. And I was involved in the anti-war movement, again, in Vietnam. And during the 60s. And that war was actually fairly popular to begin with. Hard to believe, but true.
Yeah.
First World War was not. It was unpopular to start with. And it became more unpopular as time went on and the casualties mounted. So the government had a problem. They wanted to fight a war to the bitter end that was totally unpopular. And their response was to suppress dissent. So that's the context in which I'm writing about. And so I've looked at a variety of key questions in that context. One of the important questions I look at is Eugene Debs. Hopefully all your audience knows about Eugene Debs.
Sure they do.
A very popular person. He was the Socialist Party presidential candidate for several times and once nearly got 1 million votes and 6% of the vote. But more important than that, he just had enormous amount of credibility among working class people, including those who weren't socialists. But people respected Debs. They thought he was honest. He stated what he really believed, unlike our current president.
Yeah.
And, so he just had a huge amount of credibility. And nonetheless, Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, went after him. They indicted him under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was passed in June 1917, a few months after the United States entered the war, and it said that if you were convicted of obstructing the war effort or the draft, you could be sentenced up to 20 years in prison. And so he was convicted and spent 2.5 years in prison. He was pretty old at the time. He was in his 60s and in very bad health. So it really had a huge impact on him. So that's one of the things I write about, how he made that decision to give the speech in Canton, Ohio, that led to prison, and the amnesty campaign that rose out of it. I want to look at all those kinds of things carefully. I should say, just the way I do research is I like to dig. I think of myself as a mole. So I like to go to archives. I like to dig around and see what really is going on. So that's what I did for this book. Spent a lot of time in the National Archives in D.C. and other archives. And you'd be surprised. Stuff is there. You got to dig, but it's there. And for instance, at one point, they were trying to pressure Debs into coming out for the war, or at least muting his opposition. And they ran a covert operation to try and convince him to do that. So that's one of the things I write about in the book. So I'll stop there to give you a little idea of what the book is about.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview, and definitely I'm really excited for us to be able to talk a little bit more in depth about Debs's politics and some of the tensions in the Socialist Party and everything else. So Eric, I'm curious too, and maybe you spoke to this a little bit. I guess I want to ask you two questions. One, what sort of drove your interest in this particular period? And I'm wondering, has there been much exploration or much research and historical work done on the way that free speech was being suppressed and the sort of severity of that and the intensity of the reaction, especially during wartime conditions of World War I? I mean, was this an area that you didn't really see anything else out there and that drove your interest in it?
I think it was more that this was a period in which the U.S. left was much more organized and had much more support than is currently the case, or has been since then. The IWW, for instance, after the United States entered the war in April 1917, organized 2 large-scale militant strikes in the copper mines in Arizona and timber camps throughout the Pacific Northwest. Now, these were 2 critical industries. And needless to say, Woodrow Wilson was not pleased. And in other words, the radical left was actually seen as a genuine threat to what was going on. And they moved on that basis. So I was really intrigued by that, the idea that a group of leftists could organize enough people, do enough militant actions that the powers that be actually took them seriously, not just as, sort of out there, but really as a serious threat. And I wanted to see how the left dealt with that, and what kind of disagreements and debates there were, and then also how the government responded to that. So that's really what drew. Now, in terms of what we were saying, there are books written about various. Debs, for instance, has had several biographies, but they didn't focus so much on that critical period in 1917, 1918, when the United States was at war, and how he responded to that. I mean, they covered it, but they didn't go in depth. So I thought, yeah, this is something that would be worth really seriously exploring.
Maybe for us today on the left, regardless of how long we've been on the left and the current historical material conditions, I imagine we'll talk about this quite a bit. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the relevance of understanding this particular period and the way that the left operated and then the responses to it, because it, like you said, it was seen, I mean, maybe in U.S. history, especially with Debs, was probably the most threatening that it would ever be in terms of just mass popular support. So yeah, I mean, like, what do we want to understand or think through today on the left?
Yeah, and you're right. The left had more popular support at that period than any other period in U.S. history. So it does seem very salient for us to look at now what lessons were learned, what kind of, how they dealt with it, what kind of disagreements. Or for instance, I often hear the argument, well, you can't have disunity. We all have to be unified. Well, the truth is, there was all kinds of debates going on, There's never been a time where everybody agreed. That doesn't happen. There were all kinds of debates going on between the IWW and the Socialist Party, within the Socialist Party, even within the IWW.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the nature of, political life. People have disagreements. You learn to live with that, right? And if there's enough of a social movement, you overcome those differences and you go on. So that's an example of I think, the kinds of things you can be learned. It's not like you can repeat exactly what they did, because the world has obviously changed a whole lot. Yeah. But there are things to be learned.
Leave it up to us on the left that we'll disagree about anything, no matter how small and trivial it is. So I do think it's actually a really important lesson for a lot of us, especially younger folks on the left too, that, we come into politics with a very different context of social media and the way that we interact and the way we develop our political ideas and opinions. And I think sometimes we can be very terrified of the idea that you could disagree with someone and yet still operate with political unity. I think that's something I've seen in my own organizing work, because just a little bit about me too, Eric. I mean, I actually organize, I'm a social worker, and I actually have been doing labor organizing and social work for the last 3 years. And also I come from a labor family as well in the Midwest that work construction and mental health care. And so, for me, it feels like just a necessity in actual politics on the ground to understand you're going to have disagreements, and that's actually something to not be afraid of, but to, almost like lean into a little bit, I want to say.
Yeah, well, let me just say a couple of things about my past. My parents came from Austria. They were forced to leave when the Nazis invaded Austria. My father was a lefty, so I grew up as a red diaper baby.
Yeah.
It's part of my history. So, and I was actually teaching at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and helped to organize the union there.
Oh,
so
awesome.
It's union organizing as well, so I know what that's like.
Excellent.
Helped to negotiate the contract. Anyway, so, but I think there are a lot of important kinds of, it's not a question of slavishly following some particular model. Some of the Leninist groups used to do, what would Lenin say? And no, it's not that kind of thing. But there are some kind of general lessons that you can learn. And here's another one, and it's a matter of debate within the current IWW. The IWW in its heyday fought strategically. Of course, they welcomed everybody, literally everybody, but the resources they had, which were limited, were put into organizing industries which they thought were both important and where they could have an impact. So they actually thought strategically. It didn't happen by act. For instance, the IWW at a convention decided to organize the copper miners of Arizona, and they had huge success. So it wasn't just by accident or random. They thought strategically, and again, that seems to me a generally important lesson. You try and think strategically. You have limited resources. Where are you going to put them to have the maximum impact? It seems obvious, but in fact, it's pretty controversial. There are other people who would say you want to organize the people at the absolute bottom. The IWW organized everybody, but that wasn't their criteria. They tried to think who would listen and who would have an impact. And, the copper miners, they were not at the bottom. They were actually relatively well paid. But they had a huge impact because, the government needed copper during the war. It was a vital war material. So Try and think strategically. That's another kind of lessons that I get from IWW history.
I think that's a really important thing to recognize as well. In some of my other organizing work I've been in, so I've been in, Leninist-style groups and Maoist-style groups over the years, and that is a frequent position that is taken that isn't really debated. But in terms of, well, who do we organize? I remember being part of organizing efforts that would basically say, if it was the equivalent of the copper miners today, an industry that's fairly well off, but has a very strategic place in the system of production, it wasn't thought of that way. It was basically, okay, who is very bottom of the hierarchy of capitalist oppression, and that's where we go. And you could see that sometimes there wasn't an ability to critically think through and strategically think through what kind of perspective we're taking, or it's okay, well, yes, we can identify that, but does that actually make the most sense strategically? I mean, my way of thinking about that was almost like a moral position to take. It's well, we should organize the people at the bottom because it's almost this moral stance of how we should think about organizing. And I just found that, it made it very difficult to have critical debate about what should we be doing and why, and where we should focus our efforts, especially even now with even less social support and even less resources for any kind of leftist organizing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Trying to think strategically is what we should try and do. Moral outrage will get you only so far.
Yeah.
I mean, I take it that everybody on the left is morally outraged by what's going on.
Exactly.
I think that is given. But what are we going to do about it, right? So while I'm at this, since I'm showing my books.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, what's the title of that one, Eric?
It's Yours for Industrial Freedom, and it's an IWW anthology.
Oh, awesome.
It's interesting, and it deals with some of the important issues that the WOPs argued among themselves. They say they were not all, everybody didn't agree. For instance, attitude, violence, sabotage, centralization, all these kind of debates have been going on for a long while.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how I found that in 1918, there was a trial of dozens of IWW leaders from around the country, the Chicago conspiracy trial. It went on for months, literally months, and the transcript is well over 10,000 pages. But I found the only remaining full, entire, complete transcript, which has all kinds of letters that were written between key IWW people that were presented to the jury as evidence. And then I took some of them and made an anthology from it. So,
that's awesome.
Check that out.
And any other books you want to just let listeners know that you've written? So normally what I do, Eric, is whenever I put out the episode, I'll include links to, different books and topics that we're going to cover for more research. So yeah, if there's anything else you'd like to share with listeners that you've done, please feel free.
The IWW book I wrote called Wobblies in Their Heyday, First World War, and that was put out by I was telling you how that came about. Some paperbacks by Levelers Press, which is a small workers' cooperative in Amherst, Mass. So I was doing research on that book when I found the complete transcript of the Chicago conspiracy trial. And when you do research, there's a lot of tedious stuff that you just have to go through. But occasionally you say, voila!
Yeah.
It's one of those moments when I found that transcript and I said, this is good stuff. So maybe we should get back to the current book. So you were talking about how it's relevant now. One of the debates on the left now is some people on the left seem to think that the way you deal with right-wing speakers is to stop them from speaking. If you're on campus and the Republican club wants to have one of their right-wing ideologues come and speak, you shut them down so they can't speak. And I find that a very dangerous path to go down. And the arguments that are made is, well, if you allow them a little bit of leeway, then they might grow to become a serious threat. Well, that's exactly the argument that Supreme Court judges made on the left in 1920, immediately after the First World War. They said, well, it's true the Communist Party is small now, but if we let them speak, maybe somewhere down the road they'll become you can't do that. Free speech is for everybody. That's the primary message of my book. Free speech is if it's not going to be for everybody, it's not going to work. Every idea, no matter how obnoxious, has the right to be heard. That doesn't mean at any time, everywhere. I mean, you can't call somebody up at 3 a.m., that kind of thing. But in venues that are intended for free speech, every idea should be allowed. And when you go against that, as we saw during the First World War, you better believe it'll come back on the left. People will start saying, you can't speak. your thoughts are too outrageous. We're not going to let you speak. And that's exactly what happened during the First World War.
Yeah, actually, Eric, I'm glad you kind of are digging into that, because I know that at the very last paragraph of the introduction you had, I think you kind of state very clearly that that's really what this is going to be about, is sort of the necessity of free speech precisely for those reasons. I wanted to ask you too, I mean, one of the things we like to do on the show a lot is sort of try to be kind of actively thinking through and exploring the ideas of the books that we're working through on each episode. And I was curious, whenever you think about the role of free speech, especially during the First World War and now, do you think that there's a dynamic about not being in power that really makes it a necessity to preserve free speech for everyone, and how that could possibly change if, let's say, the left was in power one day? Do you think that it would still be the same, like for you, that you would want, it would still be free speeches for everyone?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I'm for free speech now, is I think that we should do a prefigurative politics. What we're doing now should look forward to the way we see the future society. And absolutely, I see a future society in which there will be free speech for everyone. And in a more meaningful sense than there is now. We're here on our podcast, but they have, TV stations, mass newspapers, they have big time money. Yeah. That wouldn't be the case in a socialist society, but a lot more equal than that. So, but the fundamental idea would be, yes, you have free speech venues. There's certain places where any idea and every idea is allowed. And part of what bothers me about the counter argument on the left is there's a lack of self-confidence. Debs argued very strongly for free speech, and he argued in principle, but he also felt if the socialists can get their ideas out, people will agree with them. So, it's the government that's preventing that because they're scared of the left, right? And it seems to me too often now on the left in the United States, people are on the defensive. It's like they feel like, well, they're going to put out their ideas and they're not going to be accepted, and so therefore just suppress the other side. That's not a good way to be. You have to be confident in your own ideas and your own principles, and then people will listen to them.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I found myself thinking that quite often these days, not only doing work like, on this podcast and trying to put out ideas and different ways to think about politics, but in my organizing work, of how often I do wonder whether we really clearly and coherently can articulate what it is we believe and why, and can be powerful rhetorically to convince others and have that confidence. And I've wondered what it is that takes that away a lot of the time. I know you said you were involved in like the anti-war movement in the 60s, and one of the things that I always think most about and I always feel most inspired about is listening to someone like Fred Hampton from that period. And one of the things that drew me to Fred Hampton and actually helped me, I think, become a lot more radical and revolutionary in my politics was to listen to someone who can clearly articulate and has that almost like rhetorical power to articulate, this is what we believe and why, but also could compassionately and openly hear other ideas and debate them.
Why do I have a lot of arrests? Because of harassment. Why is that harassment? Because the people that harass me have set up a problem that made me disagree with them violently, and they set up this problem in order to exploit me and other people like me. And why they want to get rid of me? Because I'm saying something that might wake up some other exploited people and some other oppressed people. And if all these people ever get together, then these pigs that are exploiting us, we'll be able to run them into the lake. That's why they want to get rid of us. And it's just, it's sort of like a primary thing with me. I'm the first move that they'll make. I'm a part of an organization that will be the first organization they'll move on, because I happen to be a part of an organization, the Black Panther Party, that is the only organization, in fact, that has came out and stood up loud and clear and said that we don't care what anybody says, whether they have guns or not, and badges or 18 uniforms. If whenever they step outside the bounds of legality into the bounds of illegality, then we'll blow their brains out if they're bothering the people. And what makes them mad about that? They're constantly bothering the people. Anybody that's out there for the protection of the people happens to be in direct conflict with them. What makes them mad about it? What makes them mad about it is that they have black people and white poor people and red poor people and Puerto Rican poor people and Latin American Puerto Rican people of poor people of all descents. They had them caught up in movements based on racism when the Black Panther Party stood up and said that we don't care what anybody says. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We said we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. We stood up and said we're not going to fight reactionary pigs and reactionary state's attorneys like this and reactionary state's attorneys like Hanrahan with any other reactions on our part. We're going to fight their reactions where all of us people are getting together and have an international proletarian revolution.
Right on. Right on.
And that's saying all power to the people.
Right on.
That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes. And that's saying there's a class over here and there's a class over there. And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off its back, because this is lower, this is upper, this is the oppressed, this is the oppressor, this is the exploited, this is the exploiter. And these people in this class have divided themselves. They say, I'm black and I hate white people. I'm white and I hate black people. I'm Latin American and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly and I hate Indians. So we fight amongst each other.
I think James Baldwin was always a real figurehead for this as well. So, I mean, this is maybe like taking us outside of the book, but it does seem really relevant of just how important it is for us to really, truly believe these ideas and to know how to articulate them and be persuasive to other people. I think that's something that we don't really have a lot of sources these days to learn how to do that, I think.
No, I think you're right. And that's, of course, part of what a social movement does. Is it draws people in who are new to politics, educates them, and provides them with the kinds of skills that are needed so that you can try and talk with your fellow workers. That's all part of building a social movement. But I think to start with, you have to have the confidence that your ideas are good ideas and they're going to be heard. Yeah. And the way forward is not trying to squash somebody else, prevent somebody else from speaking. That's a dead end. That's not going to work. On a pragmatic level and also theoretical level, it's a dead end. So that's part of what I was writing about in the book. And it is interesting how these debates actually came up during World War I and immediately afterwards. There was a whole school of thought. Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Brandeis are the two most well-known ones. But it was a whole milieu which said that you don't want to you want a middle position. You don't want the extreme of either side. And the extreme was the traditional English common law was that any speech that he provided any possibility of illegal actions was against the law. That was one, and on that you could squash anything. Mm-hmm. And on the other was the they called extreme position of free speech for everyone. And they wanted to argue for a middle position where it becomes contingent depending on the specific circumstances. And I think a lot of people still think in those kind of terms, and I think it's a dangerous kind of thing to do. It isn't just free speech, it's also surveillance. Yeah. When we live in a surveillance state, and they always justify that on the basis of, well, you have to weigh individual liberties with the national needs. No, I don't think so. You have a right to privacy, to speak with others and write to others without intervention. And actually, the Constitution provides for if the government thinks you're so dangerous, then go to court, get a warrant, and go from there. But they don't want to do that. They just want to, just on their own, the FBI or whoever, National Security Agency, overlook. And that began in World War I. They were doing that already in World War. They were tapping phones without a warrant. They were breaking in at night. They were doing all those kinds of things which are totally illegal. So I think we should state that real clearly. Those are not contingent rights. Those are absolute rights. And that's a different way of looking at things than actually is the dominant thinking.
Whenever you think about free speech as an absolute right, it also seems like you're thinking of it as that there are certain places or zones or whatever, whenever, yes, like that would be a venue in which all ideas are welcome. I'm also wondering how much you think there are places whenever maybe that would not be the case, even if we're preserving this, like free speech as an absolute right.
No, I think you're right. And part of it's the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't go to somebody's house you don't like to, and at 3 a.m. set up a loud picket line. That you can't do things. That's not a venue. That's not the right time and place. Uh-huh. I think most of us understand. That. Yeah. A more immediate thing recently, that on both sides, people were surrounding those they don't like and screaming and yelling at them. And that's not really free speech. That's intimidation. You're trying to intimidate the other person, not trying to have a serious discussion with them. I think really we understand that there are certain places and times that this is inappropriate. But there are other times that it's perfectly appropriate. I can stand on the street corner and hand out any flyer I want. No matter, if you don't like it, don't pick up the flyer. That's simple enough. And, stand on a street corner, and as long as you don't have a sound system that blares several blocks away, you can say whatever you want. I mean, these are all sort of important rights. And I think it's sort of, you can think of maybe specific situations where it might be a little difficult to ascertain, but most situations, it's pretty clear. This is a time and place where it makes sense, and other places where it doesn't make sense. I was actually thinking, I had a recent thing of we have buskers on our streets in Glasgow, and we had a preacher. There aren't too many of those left anymore. People don't listen to preachers much anymore. But this preacher had a sound system that you could hear, and I didn't appreciate it, because then I don't have a choice to not listen, because he's bellowing it. So that's an example of he moved beyond. He had every right to babble about the Bible, but he didn't have every right to get a sound system that I had to hear for 3 blocks away. Common sense, I think.
I have one more question for you, Eric, and then I know that as part of going through the book, I wanted you to just be able to walk through and either touch on specific chapters and situations. But before we do that, I am curious. I've always thought very often in this sort of discussion about Marx's quote from Capital about whenever right meets right, like equal rights sort of meet each other, that force decides. And I was curious, how, in that example of the preacher, do you think that there's a way that force or power and who has power disproportionately in society, really does shape the way that free speech typically is either valued or not valued or allowed or not allowed?
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of my book is during the First World War, the government squashed free speech because they saw the left as a threat. I think that's something we have to take into consideration is you can't count on the courts to defend your rights. I mean, leaving aside the Trump justices, when none of us have illusions about that. Yeah. But even the liberal justices weren't very good during the First World War. Yeah, it's an important lesson to be learned. So sure, but in terms of what's going on now, as we were talking about before, sure, we live in a time where there is large-scale free speech. On the other hand, it's not really, they have access to media that we can't even dream about. So, they shape the discourse by money. They're really in power. And that's an important thing to recognize as well. But nonetheless, it's not a small victory, and it was fought hard to get to where we are now. One thing I mentioned, that there were these criminal syndicalist laws that were passed to get the IWW, specifically to get the IWW, said you couldn't advocate force or sabotage. And they went after the IWW, and they were ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. And in 1969, the court overturned that, said that those laws were unconstitutional. And it's interesting, after all these years it was used against the IWW, it was used against the Communist Party, it was the Ku Klux Klan. Actually, a case came up in Ohio where the local authorities were going after the Klan under the criminal syndicalist laws, and it was on that basis that they were ruled illegal. What I always thought still think it's rather ironic, when you think about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Nonetheless, it was a good decision. It was a good decision. They were right. Even the Klan has the right to present its views. They don't have the right to beat up people, that kind of threaten them, but they have a right to present their views.
Eric, on that note, how would you like to go through the material? I mean, I know, there's a lot of different things to cover, a lot of different laws and developments and Debs and the IWW. So again, you're kind of in the driver's seat here. So how would you like to sort of lead listeners through the book?
So the first chapter deals with the British experience. So it's not about the United States, it's about Britain during World War I. And part of the reason I did that is the Wilson administration relied heavily on what was done in Britain in figuring out their strategy with how to deal with the left. They passed this statute called the Defense of the Realm Act. Then it authorized the government to issue regulations to implement that act. And it was really the DORA regulations that were that really got, and there were lots of them. There were dozens of DORA regulations. And they just dealt with all kinds of things. For instance, one of the DORA regulations said if a printer printed something that was viewed as seditious, opposing the war, the army could come in, seize that, not only seize the written material, seize the print, the actual print, which was costly, to say the least, right? And no warrant, no court, no nothing. The army had the authority to do that. So the DORA regulations gave a huge amount of power to the military. The military could internally deport people. There were cases in Glasgow where union organizers were deported from one part of Britain to another for the length of the war. Could go on for years, away from their family. That's it, you're out of here. So these were really draconian measures, and they weren't just on paper; they were used. And so I wanted to look at that. And it turns out, another one of those Walla moments doing research, I was in the Parliament archives, and it turns out that a lot of these regulations were written by military intelligence officers using the experiences of the Boer War. Britain was fighting, and before First World War, they were suppressing the Boers in South Africa. And so they had virtual martial law, and they wrote up a whole bunch of regulations to implement that. And those regulations then were in the DORA regulations, some of which then wound up in the U.S. So it shows you how things can move. I don't think people realize that these were written for martial law, direct army rule.
That was actually one of the things I appreciated most in that first chapter, because I think sometimes we don't realize the sort of way that colonial regulations and laws and these methods of suppression were transferred across the Atlantic to the U.S., and that there's this deep sort of way that imperialism is embedded into these contexts, and militarism is all kind of like part of this global system. So to me, I thought the idea of internal deportation, I was curious if there were examples you found of internal deportation being used in colonial contexts as well.
No, I didn't find that. The Brits in South Africa built concentration camps.
Yeah.
They just swooped people up, men, women, children, threw them in concentration camps. And of course, this was a very racist society, but the people in concentration camps were white, and they died in droves. So that was what they did. They were operating out far bigger scale.
Yeah.
For the British government during the First World War, they were aiming at the leaders. Mm-hmm. They weren't taking large numbers of people, but they were trying to get at, and they did get at the leadership. But don't kid yourself, that hurts. I mean, if you figure you raise your head above the parapet and you're going to go off and get thrown into jail or sent into internal deportation, it's a definite disincentive. So that's what they did. It's interesting, even though the Wilson administration relied on these DORA regulations for much of, for the Espionage Act, Wilson was rather reluctant to have the military directly involved. He wanted to primarily have civilian, because I think he thought he would lose control. And in fact, the British government did. I mean, to a large extent, it was the military ruled. So while he did use the military in one particular case, he generally tried to avoid it. And so those parts of the DORA regulations they did not take over. I'll get to that a little later.
And on that note, Eric, do you think that there was also some disincentive to involve the military so directly because of the U.S. Constitution and the sort of context of obviously like occupation by military on domestic soil? Do you think that was maybe also an influence?
Well, it's a more general question. To what extent does the Bill of Rights act in crisis situations? Does it really? I guess my general take on, it's surprising the extent to which the U.S. experience and the British experience were similar. Nonetheless, the Bill of Rights gave civil liberties lawyers something to grab onto. They could say, look, it says right there. Now, of course, the courts could ignore that, but it gave, in Britain, you couldn't even do that, right? They just said, well, let Parliament decide, that's it, you're off, go on. So it gave you a little bit of an advantage. Nonetheless, both of the experiences in Britain and the United States were dismal for civil liberties, despite the Bill of Rights. And unfortunately, all too often, courts ignored it.
Yeah.
For one excuse or another.
In my own lifetime, thinking about the Patriot Act and the context of 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I wonder, thinking about World War I, that I remember whenever the Patriot Act was passed, at least from my perspective, it seemed that the willingness to give up liberties and give up rights for the sake of security seemed to be sort of alarming how easily that went over. Like, I know that there were, obviously the anti-war protests were, at least at the time, I remember, considered the largest ever in terms of sheer numbers. But I wondered, was there a lot of resistance to things like DORA and the Espionage Act because of the unpopularity of the war at the time?
Yeah, the Espionage Act was very unpopular, as was the war, right?
Yeah.
But the anti-war opposition did actually try and organize around civil liberties issues, and they had quite a lot of support in doing that. And they even got some pro-war people, liberals who supported the war and were willing to speak up against the erosion of civil liberties. So, yeah, and that's, the Debs amnesty thing was very much about that, right? He became a symbol. I mean, if Woodrow Wilson could throw Debs into jail on a very flimsy basis, what's to stop, So, yeah, even people who were generally supported the administration said, no, you've gone too far. And it became a big campaign. So I think, it's a good point you're making. These are important issues. We shouldn't be, on the left, shouldn't be embarrassed about organizing around them. And that means sometimes you're on the same platform with people you politically disagree with about other things, but you agree on civil liberties issues, you agree that First Amendment means what it says, and that's worth doing, right? And not that you should stop disagreeing about other things. Don't mute your disagreements about other things, but you can agree on that particular thing, and that happened during the First World War.
Where should we go next after that, Eric? Is there more about
so that
Boer
was the
that you want to?
The second was what became the American Civil Liberties Union.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. The ACLU, we all know about the ACLU, and they make a point of saying they defend free speech rights for everybody, no matter what whether they agree with them or not. And I think that's the right position, and they do that. But it's interesting, historically, that's not how it arose. It arose out of a group of people who were opposed to the war, American Union against militarism, but were reluctant to actually continue to organize against the war once the U.S. entered, because they knew they would wind up in jail. Mm-hmm. So they created the Civil Liberties Bureau, which became the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which became the ACLU. That is a direct one-to-one tie there. So it's interesting to look at that, how that came about. And they would say, well, it's true we're defending these people who are radicals, but we're not. We're just doing this because we believe in free speech. You actually look at their, they were opposed to the war.
Yeah.
Just letting somebody else go out and do it, they faced repression, and they were so it's a little ironic. Anyway, they too, after a while, they became a focus of government repression, even though they were trying to avoid it very hard. Mm-hmm. They became a focus for government repression. Their offices were raided. They were threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act. There seems to have been some kind of quasi-deal made, which kept them out of jail, in return for which they, dropped certain things. It's There's evidence in the files that there was a deal trying to figure out exactly what was in the deal. It's harder to figure out, but Roger Baldwin, who was the executive secretary of the ACLU and the NCLB, at one point went to the IWW prisoners in Leavenworth and tried to sell them on a deal for pardon, which was they knew would divide them, was very divisive, and you got to wonder whether this wasn't part of the deal that had been made to keep him and the ACLU people out of jail. Now, I can't prove it, but it does look really rather suspicious. So
yeah, definitely.
So anyway, this kind of thing, I think, in terms of lessons from today, just because you're the ACLU or some civil liberties lawyer doesn't mean that you're not going to be targeted by the government. I don't believe they'll come after you.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about, is even trying to have a more moderate stance, and even if you're defending like a more radical perspective, I think this is a real question that a lot of people I know today, especially involved in groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, I have a lot of friends who are involved in DSA, and I talk to them, and they will say that, well, obviously I believe like much more radical things, but realistically, and to not be targeted or to not come off more threatening than I want to be, I should like temper that. And I can't help but wonder if we should say, well, listen, if you're going to be branded a radical and be suppressed anyway, why not just state your opinions? I was curious like how this point in history helps us think about that.
That was actually part of what happened in the IWW. When the U.S. entered the war, Big Bill Haywood, and it wasn't just him, quite a few of the leadership of the IWW, even though they were opposed to the war, said, let's be careful how we state this. Let's not come on too strong, because we know the government will go after us, which is true. They would. Yeah. But they went after them anyway, right? So it didn't really do any good, and you're just confusing your membership. Tell it the way it is, Yeah. If you're against the war, speak out against it. And so, but with the ACLU people, you're right, part of that was they were trying to deflect the hostility. But I think it's also interesting that I think they sort of thought that, well, here we are, we're lawyers, counselors, it's all in the legal system. They can't go after us. Wrong. They can go after you. Just because you're a lawyer, you got a law degree, doesn't mean they can't come after you. They can come after you if they think you're a threat.
I think that was a really important thing I gathered from the book as well, is that, even if you're very trained and involved in these systems like the legal system, or, even like I said, I'm a social worker, a lot of social workers believe very strongly that if you are abiding by certain laws or part of certain institutions, that it protects you in a certain way. But I think the history, not only for this period, but also I'm thinking about, suppression of groups during the 60s and 70s and COINTELPRO and some of those, incredibly violent and destructive tactics. It's almost like, we have to take very seriously the fact that just because you're abiding by certain laws or you might be a lawyer doesn't mean that you're not going to be deeply, deeply threatening, or you'll be interpreted as being deeply threatening, even if you're not, which is one of the things I always took the most from the 60s is like MLK being targeted and the severity of how he was targeted and what they did to try to ruin his life is, to me, it's a valuable lesson to know this history, to just understand kind of what you should expect in conditions like this.
Yeah, I think part of what my research has shown me is that this tends to spread out. So that at first, the administration went out after the most radical people, IWW being very much in the forefront of that. But after they dealt with the IWW, then they started coming after the moderate wing of the Socialist Party, and they seriously considered prosecuting the National Civil Liberties Bureau, and the list goes on. So, because after all, if you have power, you begin to think that anybody who's in your way, what are they then doing? You know what's right. Yeah. They don't. Get out of the way. And if you don't get out of the way, you can become a target. One of the things I wrote about in the first chapter of the British Experience, it actually got to the point where the War Cabinet and the X Committee, with a subgroup of it, was seriously discussing how to suppress a conservative newspaper. A conservative Tory newspaper. They were thinking of how to do it because they were criticizing the government for its, specific war policies. So that's how far it can go, So once you get that mentality, you got all the answers. You know what to be done. It's a crisis situation. Get out of the way. And anybody who criticizes you, watch out.
I imagine we could probably look at that as a common feature of any state and any sort of political situation, the temptation to basically see anything that criticizes you as being, kind of inherently an enemy that must be suppressed. I mean, we could talk about obviously like fascist dictatorships. We could talk about the state and like the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. So it seems like this is a common challenge about not only like opposing power, but also in the event that you were to have power yourself, the sort of temptation for that.
Well, I think that's why it's important to have these discussions now, so we as clear as possible about the need for free speech, the need for oppositions, and need for democratic procedures. That these aren't just things that we should waive. That when we are the minority, we should hold on to these as important principles. I mean, nothing guarantees, but it sure helps. If you start thinking about it now, I think that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that too. I think a lot of times on the left, we have a hard time engaging with these questions now for the sake of, ideally, fingers crossed, we would get a chance to sort of actually have some kind of political power at some point. We would have already thought through this and not be so blindsided by the temptations of power and having control of, let's say state institutions or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, on some campuses, you do actually have some power on the left. And so it's important, even right now, even though that's a very, it's a very narrow power, it's still a power, right? So, let's use it wisely and try and prefigure, for the wider society, what we would do rather than trying to replicate exactly what they're doing. Yeah. That is, suppress whoever disagrees with. Power is a dangerous thing. I think that's one of the lessons that you learn. It's not to say that on the left we shouldn't think strategically about how to get some power, but it's dangerous, and you want to think about how you will make it as democratic as possible. Term limits, for instance, I think those are an excellent idea. Nobody should be in any post for very long. It's bound to lead to bad things. Transparency, another thing. I mean, we can be transparent in our own organization. We can do that now. We don't need state power for that. Yeah. Let's have transparent organizations that have term limits on officers, that encourage debate, all those kinds of things. We can do that now. That doesn't require state power. And it tells everybody around us that we're serious about building a different kind of society, not just replacing one group of schmucks with another one.
No, I agree with that, and that is proven true time and time again in my organizing work. Whenever you're involved in a group that is basically organizing with the same conception of power as the very thing that you're wanting to oppose, and then you wonder, why is it that you see the same problems, you see the same dynamics, and people, experience violence and trauma. I'm a therapist, so I deal with trauma and the nature of power and trauma, and I see that a lot in my organizing work, that we're just replicating the same exact form of power all the time, and we think that you can just change out the content and it's going to be different. It's like, no, it's the form of how we think that power should be wielded that we have to be really critical of.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And actually one of the things I like about the IWW is they actually tried to think about things like that, tried to maintain a democratic organization, encourage debate, and not be dogmatic, and all those kind of things. That's actually quite impressive, because you're dealing with people who were rough and ready. They're real working class types. So, But they thought about these kind of things. They wanted to have a democratic organization, and to a large extent they did. It can be done, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. This is not impossible. You just have to put your mind to it. Say these are important values.
I totally agree. I mean, the organizing I do now, our starting point is transparency, democratic sharing of power, and it seems like as long as you think critically about it and use some history for examples and don't reinvent the wheel, it's absolutely possible. So that's maybe the good news. It's like, as long as you're thinking about this, and for listeners out there who we have a lot of people who are organizing and getting involved in organizing in left politics, these things have to be at the forefront if you don't want to just replicate power the way that we already find it. Okay, so where do you want to pick up? Do you want to talk about Debs and the IWW for the second half?
Debs went to jail for a speech he gave in Canton, Ohio. It was a long speech. I was thinking of how different times are now. At that time, people would listen to an hour and a half speech. I think now people would, I don't care how good the speaker was. But it was a long speech, and most of it actually had to do with socialism and free speech, but a small part of it had to do with the war. And in the process, Debs referred to American soldiers as cannon fodder. And that was a primary basis on which he was indicted and convicted under the Espionage Act. By calling American soldiers cannon fodder, he was discouraging them from enlisting. So it's interesting, Debs was already in his early 60s when this happened. He was not in good health, and the war had been going on for about 14 months already. So he did not rush into this. He thought about it a long time. He knew that the speech would be heavily surveyed, and that he was likely to go to jail if he spoke there, and he went ahead anyway. One reason he did that was that the government was running a covert operation to pressure him into coming out for the war. And one of the things they did was they planted articles in newspapers that said he had changed his mind and that he was now supporting the war. So he was furious about that, and the socialist press had been largely suppressed, so it was hard to get his ideas out through the socialist press. So speaking at a large rally was one way he could make his views known. So it was important for him, for that reason, I think, to make clear to other people on the left that he had not changed his mind. He still opposed the war. He thought it was imperialist war. That's why he spoke. So it took a lot of courage, needless to say, because he knew he was likely to go to jail for quite a while. So that's one of the things about Debs. It's interesting that while he was speaking, there were people going around the audience of I think it was up to 1,000 people going around checking for young men whether they had registered for the draft. There was conscription, and for those who did not, they were immediately hauled off. That was going on while he was speaking, just to give you a sense of the kind of context they were operating in. It was heavy duty. It was a very tense scene. And I think one reason that Debs was a little careful in what he said is he was afraid the government would intervene and stop him from finishing his speech. And he wanted a chance to give the whole speech. Canton speech.
Another eloquent voice against World War I was that of Eugene Debs, the railroad union organizer and leader of the Socialist Party. On June 18, 1918, he addressed a mass rally of workers in Ohio, knowing that his words could lead, as they did, to his arrest and imprisonment. His sentence of 10 years was upheld by unanimous Supreme Court decision. Here is the speech that led to his arrest.
Sam Johnson declared that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He must have had the Wall Street gentry in mind, or at least their prototypes. For in every age it has been the tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped himself in the cloak of patriotism, or religion, or both, to deceive and overawe the people. Every solitary one of these aristocratic conspirators and would-be murderers claims to be an arch-patriot. Every one of them insists that the war is being waged to make the world safe for democracy. What humbug! What rot! What false pretense! Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. In the Middle Ages, when the feudal lords concluded to enlarge their domains, to increase their power, their prestige, and their wealth, they declared war upon one another. But they themselves did not go to war, any more than the modern feudal lords, the barons of Wall Street, go to war. The feudal barons of the Middle Ages, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of our day, declared all wars, and their miserable serfs fought all the battles. The poor, ignorant serfs had been taught to revere their masters, to believe that when their masters declared war upon one another, it was their patriotic duty to fall upon one another and to cut one another's throats for the profit and glory of the lords and barons who held them in contempt. And what is war in a nutshell? The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. The working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish their corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die. That is their motto. And we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. If war is right, let it be declared by the people.
I was curious, even though you're focusing on Debs and these two chapters in the Canton speech, did you see much about how widespread it was, that there would be like articles planted basically just spreading disinformation, or that someone had changed their views about the war besides Debs? No,
I think Debs was a particular target. I mean, there were other things that they did. They raided offices. They, for IWW as a whole, there was a coordinated assault on every level, and to the point where people who were working for the General Defense Committee, raising money for their defense, who were not wobbly activists, were prosecuted and convicted under the Espionage Act and spent time in a maximum security prison. They weren't wobbly activists. They were just raising money for the defense. That's how extreme it got. So, yeah. But this particular tactic of trying to convince people that somebody had changed their mind was particularly, I think, for Debs, because he was such an important figure. It mattered what he what he said, So they tried to obfuscate that, and he wanted to clarify it. So that was the Canton speech, and actually went right immediately after he gave it. Some of the people in the federal government were not so sure that he had actually violated the Espionage Act. There was debates within the government whether they should go ahead, but I think the decision was made by Wilson. He was the one who he was very vindictive, and he actually told his chief of staff that Debs had been a traitor for giving the speech. A serious thing to say, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about Wilson's particular targeting of Debs and this sort of very, very intense reaction he had to Debs in particular.
Well, Wilson was a vindictive person. I mean, he was known for that. If you opposed him on something he thought was important, watch out. He'd come back after you. He was a vindictive person. And same with the Wobbs. Wobbs, long after the war had ended, he wouldn't even consider pardoning them. He wouldn't even consider it because they were the IWW. They had gotten in his way. So it wasn't just Debs, but Debs was an important example of that. It's just a very vindictive person. And one of the arguments that went on about free speech during the war was that, during the Civil War, you had Abraham Lincoln, who had a lot of power. Mm-hmm. And some people, liberals, argued, he dealt with it relatively well. I think you could argue that. He was actually pretty willing to throw people in the jail who disagreed with him. But he wasn't vindictive. That he wasn't. Once it was, he would move on. Wilson was. Wilson wasn't vindictive. And that sort of undercut their argument that, the benevolent dictator kind of argument, because, often people with power aren't very benevolent, and Wilson wasn't.
That's true. Yeah. And I'm also curious, too, because accusing Debs of being a traitor and trying to, again, prosecute him and throw him in jail under the Espionage Act, for listeners who aren't familiar with what the Espionage Act really said or what its general provisions were, could you just describe briefly, what exactly it said and how it was utilized for these suppression tactics?
Okay, well, the Espionage Act, as you can tell from its title, was actually primarily written about espionage. That is, people, spies who were sent by the German government to get military secrets. That was so the first couple of titles in it have to do with, and they're still in effect, with espionage. But the guy writing it, his name was Charles Warren, using the experience of Britain, wanted to put in the same act ways to suppress the anti-war opposition. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk more about Warren. He was an important figure. But anyway, he drafted it, and one section said, you were violating the Espionage Act if you acted to obstruct the draft or the recruitment of soldiers. And under that provision, for instance, you gave a speech in which you called the American soldiers cannon fodder. That wasn't just Debs. Other people went to jail for saying that. So it was interpreted as anything that you said that could undermine morale was violating the Espionage Act. And you could be sentenced for up to 20 years. And there were people sentenced up to 20 years. Big Bill Haywood got a 20-year sentence. Mm-hmm. The Socialist Party leadership got a 20-year sentence. Luckily, the Supreme Court overruled it. But so you could do some heavy-duty time, and Wobbs spent about 5 years before they were pardoned, many of them, in maximum security prison. So it was a very serious thing. And, of course, the courts upheld it as constitutional. That's what happened. And I should say there were just very, very few judges who actually upheld the First Amendment. Very, very few. But one of them, Judge Borkin in Montana, was actually a conservative Republican. But he believed in the First Amendment. They hated him. The government hated him. They tried to think of ways of moving him out of Montana, which was the center of left-wing activity. Because he actually believed in the First Amendment. So, he brought cases into his court. He threw them out. Mm-hmm. But he was very much the exception. Most judges, including liberal judges, upheld convictions under the Espionage Act for, speeches and writings that we now would clearly say are protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah, I gather that the way the Espionage Act was used is that you could basically still preserve the First Amendment in law, but de facto, the Espionage Act let you define anything that could be speaking out against the war as basically being worthy of then being you could be incarcerated for, prosecuted for.
Right. The way they interpreted it, they gutted the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They gutted it. And their argument was that during the war, you could restrict free speech. That's basically what they said. National security trumped free speech rights. That's basically what they said. And so for most judges, they were willing to, anything that government brought to court, they would uphold for most judges.
I think that's something that feels eerily, there's a continuity there between even what was happening in this period of World War I to today, that essentially in a state of military conflict or war, the way that laws can be utilized or the things that allow you to de facto, gut the First Amendment, it seems to be something that has been consistent throughout the last century of American history. And I know even earlier than that too, with the alien sedition laws and all that other stuff. But it does seem like it is, particularly in the context of military engagement of war, that somehow the nature of that allows for these legal protections to be warped or sort of undermined in this really, really insidious way, I guess is how I want to describe it.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. It's actually one of the arguments that Holmes and Brandeis were making, is that during wartime, you could restrict free speech rights. And they had a hard time justifying why this was the case. Brandeis said, well, it takes time for free speech to allow for the proper outcome of public policy debates, and we don't have that kind of time in the midst of war. A pretty weak argument. The war had been going on for years, right? Yeah. And in fact, it became more and more unpopular now. But that's, kind of the counter argument was, when more do you need free speech rights in the midst of a war?
Yeah.
When public policy questions are literally life and death.
Exactly. Yeah.
Have more free speech rights everywhere, and so it's just. To me, it's one of the things I write about in the book. I think free speech rights hold whether there's a wartime or not. There was actually a case decided during the Civil War, which I think was decided correctly, that said that you have to either have imminent threat of invasion or rebellion that makes it, impossible to carry on normal judicial procedures to justify any abridgment of basic civil liberties. And unfortunately, they only made that decision after the Civil War.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was a good decision.
Yeah, it was still good, even if it was a little late.
A little late for the people who got, detained. But at least it's on the books, and we can point to it. And so I think that's the right way of viewing it. In crisis times are actually times where we should have more, rather than less in it. That's a time when people are politicized. They want to debate. Good. Let's have that debate. Mm-hmm. Let's have that discussion. And, whether, it's about the war, or even among people who support the war, what does that mean? How far should you go?
Yeah.
I mean, there are all kinds of questions arise in the midst of conscription. That's another issue. The government was very touchy about that because they knew it was very unpopular. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have to say a whole lot about conscription. You wound up in jail under the Espionage Act. But again, that's, those are important, should we have conscription? Are there any times when it's justified? I doubt it. Certainly the First World War wasn't one of them.
Well, maybe on kind of another note too, Eric, I was curious if we could talk about Samuel Gompers and the way that Gompers sort of reacted in this context as a counterpoint to Debs in terms of their politics and labor organizing specifically.
Right. Well, so Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor, and talk about term limits. He did it for about 30 years. He was entrenched.
Yeah.
And he was just terrible on every level. Terrible.
Agreed.
Just awful. He was racist. We can go on, But in terms of the First World War, he was a zealous supporter of the war. The AFL, tried to move against any kind of strikes on a grassroots level in the AFL unions. They tried to squash them as quickly as possible. And he basically supported the government as it suppressed dissent. He was just really terrible. But after the war, people began to think, well, now it's time, let's free all the political prisoners. Mm-hmm. Then he wanted to jump on board. Opportunistic as usual. Yeah. So he did nothing during the war, But now all of a sudden he was going to be the progressive. But even then, he was putting pressure on the people, the AFL unions, not to engage in public demonstrations to demand Debs' release. Try and work within the system. We'll lobby, that kind of stuff, which wasn't going to work. The only way you're going to get Debs out of jail is by mobilizing people. Mm-hmm. So even there, he was counterproductive. Even when he was, officially supporting a good thing, Debs' amnesty, he was poison. He was just a terrible person on every level.
Yeah, I still think today the legacy of Gompers and the AFL, to me, still taints a lot of discussions I've had with people about unions and the racist history of unions and supporting the state and imperialist action all over the world. And I think it's important to contextualize that within the leadership and the role that Gompers had, which isn't always talked about or even understood, of like the influence that he had on the membership and how the AFL operated politically.
Yeah, we should recognize they actually had a lot of opposition, right? The Socialist Party had a lot of influence in some of the AFL unions, and they strongly opposed Gompers not only on the war and on Debs, but more generally they were industrial unions. He was for craft unions. They were more militant. He was, wanted to avoid any strikes or anything. So they just, they were constantly at loggerheads, and they were quite influential with the AFL. Unfortunately, he controlled the central leadership, and he had the union bureaucracy behind it. So, so it was a battle. But and it's interesting. You were talking about earlier about I wrote the book because other people didn't cover it. This is one thing that's not well covered. Gompers during the First World War. There are biographies about him in his early period and as a union leader. But talking about what he actually did during the war, people they sort of fluff over that. And I think it's worth looking at more seriously because he played an important role. The Wilson administration relied heavily on Gompers to try and, smooth things out in the rank and file working class base. They did. And, so it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, even the little bit that I've studied about Gompers over the years of organizing and such, this particular period was something I never encountered before. And I think it's a really valuable historical lesson to understand that, depending on how unions are structured, how they're organized, and the way that the bureaucracies function, they can be utilized to smooth over those class divisions or make, the working class more amenable to just the state and the interests of capital. So to me, that was a great historical lesson here, was just to understand the details of how Gompers shaped the AFL to operate in this way.
Right, totally top down.
Yep.
And we were talking before about term limits. Got to have term limits. You can't have a president of a union for 30 years. I'm sorry, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's bound to lead to corruption, undemocratic procedures, because after a while, what's the contact between your president and your rank and file? None. The person hasn't been in the shop for 30 years. He's been sitting in an office for 30 years, hobnobbing with pals. So, no, you can't have that. So, but he was the antithesis of that. He viewed it basically as a lifetime appointment.
Yeah. So just again, great historical lesson about it's how the union is structured and all these sorts of ways that you build in that transparency and democratic sharing of power that are really key.
I think the next thing was the question of military tribunals, which we were talking a little bit before about the role of the military.
Yeah.
While Wilson was somewhat reluctant to use the military, there were people in his administration and in the Congress who were raring to go. They wanted to turn it over to the military. They wanted military tribunals to prosecute troublemakers, anti-war dissidents, strikers, you name it, right? And the idea was, in part, it would be quicker, but also the military was more likely to execute people.
Yeah.
And they were seriously thinking, if we can just line up a few of these IWW leaders, or maybe some other people who are key to the anti-war opposition, and shoot them, that will show them, right? So that was a serious debate, and this again something isn't talked about a lot in the books from the period because it was a serious threat they had. People supporting this idea had a majority in the Senate, no doubt about it. The Republicans and a significant number of the Democrats were for this, and they were quite explicit. You look at the debates on the Senate floor; they weren't hiding it. They were saying, "We want executions. Jail is not enough. Let's figure out a way of actually capital punishment." That's spooky. And talk about unconstitutional, of course. It was totally unconstitutional, but they didn't really care about that. But this is one good thing Wilson did. He killed it.
Yeah.
No, not under my watch.
I think that's a valuable history, especially for people on the left in the U.S., because I think a lot of times whenever we think about the outright execution of socialist or like communist labor organizers and leaders, I mean, we think about Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, we think about fascism, and to me it's a very sobering thing to realize that in this particular period, even though the mechanisms of how it functioned, the context of how it functioned is different, The end goal, though, was still a lot of people were just wanting to out and out execute anyone who opposed the war, which, obviously Debs, people in the IWW, I mean, the stakes were life and death, and they were really serious, and we should never forget that.
Yeah, no, and it shows you how far people in power will go. We were talking before about the Bill of Rights. I mean, this is just flagrantly violating that. The idea that you could try people for treason for stating their opposition to the war bore no resemblance whatsoever to what treason had historically meant, just so you would get given an excuse to execute them. That was what it was about, and that those kind of arguments could gain favor. New York Times was backing it. They ran long articles promoting this. This was actually pretty widespread, and it's interesting, not talked about much in the historical literature. I think because it's too embarrassing, to think about that this was seriously being debated within Congress. That you could declare martial law, have the military take over from the Justice Department, prosecute, and it wouldn't have just been, it would partially to have executions, but also you could widen the scope while the courts might put some stop on prosecuting the most moderate of opposition. You better believe the military for them, it was all one.
Yeah.
They saw no difference. It was all one. They're all a bunch of troublemakers. Throw them in jail, execute the leaders, and shut them up.
Yeah, Eric, I'm curious too, whenever you were involved in the anti-war movement for Vietnam, did you see any similar responses or discussions going on that were calling for these kinds of repressive and even just out and out execution of traitors at this in a similar way?
It's funny you say that, because I went to school in Ann Arbor, so we were living in an environment in which anti-war opposition was the norm. So I never really thought much about, I remember people were saying that they got hate messages and stuff like that. I don't think I really took it serious. And then, COINTELPRO, I should back up. There was one time I was in SDS, and when SDS disintegrated, we pretty much knew that one of the people who came in and promoted the splits was an agent.
Oh, yeah.
We were pretty sure of that. We were pretty sure of that. So it wasn't like we did have some idea that stuff was going on. But, I got my part of my dossier one day. One time was many years ago. It seemed like somebody reached into the shelf and just picked out at random some section of it. Anyway, it was interesting. They were actually following me physically. This was before we had electronic surveillance. Physically following me around. I never noticed it.
Wow.
It never occurred to me. So I think I'm actually pretty oblivious to
Well, either that or they were very, very good. One or the other.
I don't think it would have occurred to me,
Yeah.
It wasn't like anything I did was secret. I mean, I was quite out front, so.
I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but there's a book that we've been talking a lot about on our show lately by one of the authors is named Aaron J. Leonard, but it's called The Threat of the First Magnitude, and he's gotten a bunch of FOIA requests and done research on the actual COINTELPRO activities of SDS and a lot of the Maoist groups and stuff. And I remember the thing that stuck out to me is there was this saying that, if there are more than 5 people in a room during this period, you can guarantee that at least one of them is on the payroll for some sort of government agency. And I've never forgotten that. It always really stuck with me. And they would be surveilling people and whatever and doing all these activities almost, for no reason. It wasn't, like you said, everything was out in the open, but, they were still engaged, for anyone and everyone.
They felt like they had to do something, right? So, that was their job. But I think for me, it was different than the people during the First World War, where it was so obvious. The repression was so obvious. And, the truth is, I don't know if I could do what I did then now, because I got arrested frequently, and I was never suspended from school. I was no, they just didn't do that. Part of it was the UAW. It's hard to remember, but there actually was a time when unions counted for something, and
that's true.
The UAW had a lot of clout in the Democratic Party in Michigan, and while the UAW was no great shakes, nonetheless, they didn't really want to see the University of Michigan become a police state. So I think that was part of behind the scenes. But, I never really thought about it much. I just went, did my organizing and let it that. But now, looking back, you can see there was a lot of stuff going on. Nowhere near the level of the First World War. And that's sort of one of the lessons I draw. in a bourgeois democratic society, unlike fascism, the level of repression is very much correlated with how strong the opposition is. If you're in Hitler's Germany, you just have to go out in the street and hand out a flyer, and they'll come and execute you. It's a totalitarian state, but it's not like that here. It's modulated, it's calibrated, and the stronger the opposition, the more likely you're going to face some serious repression. While we caused a considerable amount of trouble during the 60s, it was nothing like they were doing during the First War. We didn't organize a strike of timber workers, copper miners, or anybody else. So we were on campus raising hell, but they could live with that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because one of the things I was curious to ask you about was how you would sort of think about the lessons of First World War compared to what we learned from the terror of fascism and the context. And so that's an interesting way to hear you say it, that it's about the sort of modulation or calibration based on what the opposition is, and that there is at least still this kind of balance of power that, at least is able to be changed to some degree.
I think more than that, there's a sense within at least some segments of the ruling class that it's detrimental to the system to have a society in which everything is shut down, because it doesn't encourage intellectuals, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
If you feel like if you get out of line, you're going to get executed. So I think there's that understanding that they would prefer to have a certain amount of free speech. It lubricates this, makes it work better, more innovative.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if it's going to turn out to be a lot of trouble, well, that's a different question. Then all of a sudden, the Bill of Rights goes out the window, and you crush the opposition. So, yeah, there's that kind of... And you could actually see that within the government, the Wilson administration. The people in the Justice Department who actually made the decisions who would be prosecuted under the Espionage Act tried to think these things kind of through strategically, and what was important and what was not. And for instance, some U.S. attorneys were so zealous that if you were in a bar and you said, Wilson's a jerk and I want the war to end, they would prosecute you, which is absurd when you think about it.
That's unbelievable.
But the people, that is unbelievable, yes, but it's true. But the people in the Justice Department were smarter than that, so they tried to focus on those they saw as a significant threat. So it was modulated even within that context. It wasn't just... Now, of course, you have to add to that Wilson was vindictive, so that added another layer to that, right? That wasn't really very rational. But nonetheless, there was sort of this trying to figure out what level of repression made sense.
Yeah.
Even and it was a high level of repression. Mm-hmm. Be clear, they were very... It didn't take much to get thrown into jail if you were, part of an organization that could actually pose a threat.
I feel like you've kind of been touching on this already, Eric. Do you want to talk about the IWW and the two different labor organizations?
Yeah, right. There's one chapter in the book about the IWW, as well as my book. My first book, The Wobblies in Their Heyday, deals with the copper mining strike and particularly the copper miners, and also farm workers strike. One thing we haven't mentioned, you were talking about executions. Mm-hmm. One of the leading IWW members was executed, lynched is I guess the right word, by vigilantes directly hired by corporations. They weren't just an angry mob, they were hired by vigilantes in Butte, Montana. So there were actually cases where, death squads, that's what it was.
Yep.
Frank Little. But so I dealt with the copper miners strike in the Wobblies in their heyday, and this one a timber workers strike. And the reason I was interested in it in any case, but beyond that, I was talking about how Wilson was reluctant to use the military. But in this particular case, from the time the strike started, which was within days after the U.S. entered the war, he sent soldiers to break up a perfectly peaceful strike. And then those soldiers, they weren't going to stop there. They started lifting IWW leaders, threw them into military detention, and held them indefinitely without any charges, which is totally unconstitutional. Wilson never declared martial law. And so I wanted to write about that because that dealt with the whole question of the military and to what extent they were used to suppress the dissent. I thought it was a really interesting strike. I was very impressed by the timber workers union. The copper miners are more what you think of as a classic strike. Those were big mines, thousands of people working together, like an auto factory. I mean, it's the kind of place you expect or could easily envision a militant strike. But timber workers were scattered all over the place. And what happened is they would call a strike one place, it would be suppressed, and just move off to the next one and the next one. And it just, they couldn't control it. It was just, it was very impressive organizing, very disciplined. That's another thing we haven't talked about, the lessons from the past. Contrary to mythology, the WABs during strikes were very disciplined, not only in terms of violence, that was part of it, but a lot of timber workers had alcohol problems. And the WABs said, no, during the strikes, no, don't drink. You know, pay attention to what's going on. Get on that picket line. Don't get into fights. And it worked. It worked. So I read reports from local county attorneys where there was a timber strike, and they said that not only was it peaceful, but the morale of the timber workers had never been higher. People really had, their sense of self-esteem rose. Because they could feel, you know. So I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind. Part of it, I think, we were talking before about prefigurative. They were telling people, we can organize. We can keep discipline. We're not an unruly mob. So take us seriously. And, of course, their opposition, the corporations, did the exact opposite. They tried to portray them as disorganized mobs, you know. So it's worth keeping in mind. And it was, in fact, a very effective strike, although when we were talking about modulating, you know, as time went on, the military got more and more repressive, so that it wasn't just the leaders. You just showed up in a picket line. They swooped you up. They held you for up to 2 months. The conditions were just beyond deplorable, and it had an impact. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, it had an impact, but it took months before it did. For months, they sustained this strike despite that level of military repression.
And for this particular strike, Eric, do you think it was the nature of the lumber industry itself during the war around this time that prompted Wilson to go ahead and utilize the military? Was it specifically the industry itself that influenced that?
I think it was part of that. It was part of the Democratic Party governors. So, you know, he wanted to, if they asked him for military, he wanted to cooperate. It was a key industry. Lumber was key, in part for the copper industry, because they used a lot of lumber to shore up the walls. Otherwise, they would collapse. So it was an important industry. I think that was another reason why. And because it was so scattered, there was no way you couldn't hire Pinkertons. It just wouldn't really go. So that was another reason. So I think there were a bunch of reasons, but it is interesting how quickly they moved and how the level of repression that finally came about. So that and while it was focused on the timber industry, at one point, the WABs were talking about a general strike that would include agricultural workers in Washington. They started arresting agricultural workers. You know, they were going to, you know, proactively, make sure that. And the courts did almost nothing, even though this is a blatant violation of the Constitution. So it's a really interesting strike, and it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention. So.
Yeah, it was the first time I had read about it, and I think that element of how organizing solidarity across multiple key industries like agriculture and lumber, and like the way that was seen as it was so threatening that, like we have to preemptively repress that, I think is a really valuable strategic lesson for anyone on the left today. Like how important that is to build that solidarity across industries like that.
That was the whole idea of the IWW, to have solidarity within an industry and between industries. That was the whole idea. One big union, OBU. And that was the idea. So, of course, harder to do than to talk about. But they tried. And you're absolutely right. It was seen as a very direct threat, and they moved, you know, to squash any possibility of the general strike. So, but I also just was really impressed that you know, it's not easy to organize thousands of timber workers across several states. It's sort of mind-boggling. I don't know where you begin, but they did it. Yeah, it's pretty neat, pretty impressive. So I guess that's part of also we're talking about self-consciousness. Be proud of our past. We actually did some pretty nifty things.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial as well. You know, a lot of times on our show, we want to focus on history, especially history that doesn't get talked about a lot on the left, to not only understand the things that were failures and the lessons, but also to, understand the victories that we had or the things that we did in the midst of unbelievable conditions, unbelievable challenges. And a strike like this, the fact that they did this is, especially today with the way that unions are today, it's almost impossible to believe you could do it, but they did it. The impossible happened, and it's good for us to carry that along with this as well.
You're absolutely right. And it's important to remember that and to try and figure out, learn what lessons we can from that. And one of the things that was interesting about the timber workers' strike is they started off with a rather small set of demands. The biggest one was the 8-hour day, but as time went on, they kept adding more demands. Like the conditions in the bunkhouses were appalling and crowded, and no showers, and food was dreck, and just went on and on. Healthcare was miserable, and they just kept adding more demands. They said, well, okay, so let's do it. So then after a while, the list kept growing and growing. I'm sure they realized they weren't going to win all these things.
Exactly.
But they wanted the membership to feel that they were listening to them and hearing what they had to say, and they shared their concerns. And in fact, to the extent that the union had an impact, it was more. They never did win the 8-hour day, but they did actually win some improvement in bunkhouses, showers, food, not safety. They didn't do that, but they did win some demands, some victories along those lines. So it was interesting. And so just sort of the feedback between leadership and rank and file, and it's definitely worth looking at.
Eric, I know I'm coming up on the end of the book, so what would you like to focus on just for the last kind of section of the discussion today?
Okay, we actually looked at a lot of the book so far, and I talked a little bit about the last section about the free speech as a theory and the kind of debates that went on around it. I guess to just talk a little bit more about how it came out of a certain milieu. Most progressives opposed the war, even if they became silent once it became clear it was dangerous to oppose the war. But there was a certain segment that supported the war actively. And as the war went on and it became clear that Wilson was vindictive and that they were squashing any kind of dissent, they tried to start thinking through free speech, civil liberties, which had not been major issues before then, but they started, and it was out of that milieu that you got Holmes and Brandeis and Chafee and all that. They didn't just come in. Sometimes you feel like, particularly when I read law books, history books, that it sort of comes out of intellectual cogitation. Not the case. In fact, this was coming out of a very real set of circumstances and a certain milieu that went well beyond the lawyers and judges, and they were responding. Holmes and Brandeis were responding to that. The journal New Republic at that time was very widely read. And Holmes was an avid reader, for instance, and was taken very seriously. And so they began complaining about how, the Wilson administration was just going too far. There had to be some limits, there had to be some room for debate, right? And it was out of that debate, that you developed these clear and present danger arguments and the balance of conflicting forces. And so they tried to think through how could they theorize what they were looking for. In any case, there's some check, so the courts could have some check on what the Wilson administration was doing, and that was sort of the context in which these theories arose. So, as I started, I've never done this kind of research before. I was struck how important it was to put the historical context of these key decisions. They didn't arise out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Or somebody sitting in their library, or even out of previous cases. They arose out of what people could see directly around them. They were responding to that and to the people that they agreed with, the progressive pro-war people. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, and obviously it holds for today as well. The court decisions don't come out of nowhere. With the Republicans, it's obvious they're ideologues, but it's true as well for the liberals. They come out of a certain context and sort of argue on some kind of try and justify it as previous decisions doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It depends on the specific circumstance. In that specific circumstance, what kind of theories arise. And that's part of what I look at in the book, is how clear and present danger came out of that milieu, and how the balance of conflicting forces, which is really an underpinning, which says that you don't have an absolute right free speech. It's contingent. You have to weigh the interests of the government, of national security versus the interests of the individual. That kind of pragmatic, that arose out of a specific set of circumstances. And so it was interesting to sort of watch, as I was reading, because I didn't come in with any preconceived ideas, never done any research around this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So just to see, as I read it, it became clear to me that this makes sense in the given context. But of course, it was very limited because they were pro-war, so they thought that it was perfectly all right for the government to go after the IWW, which did actually represent a threat to the war effort.
Yeah, I thought that was really helpful to read through this section as well. I remember, going through school as a kid, and you learn about some of these Supreme Court, the justices and these decisions, and you do get them as this kind of disembodied sort of decision that's made almost, specifically through sitting in your chambers, thinking through an argument. And to understand that, the historical material context shapes decisions in the way that they do, I think is a really vital thing. Not too long ago, we had a really well-known guy on the left who does a lot of podcasts named C. Derek Varn, and we had a big discussion about the way that a lot of people on the left learn history, especially U.S. history, prior to the Great Depression. A lot of us still carry around the same ways of thinking about that history that we had from going through school as kids. And so we have to step back and understand and to rethink that history in a different way, and to understand, the material context of what was going on. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is a big question, but I think that this whole period is a huge historical gap in almost everyone's mind on the left, at least people that I run into. And I've always been curious, why that is, or why is it that this particular history is typically the one that no one really knows about or learns very much about. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I mean, considering, our different generations, it might be different for you than for me, but this whole era just seems something that just very rarely ever gets talked about or discussed. But obviously with your book, it's incredibly relevant. It's incredibly important to understand.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a good question because I feel the same way. That it gets underplayed. World War One, not just on the level I'm talking about of questions of the anti-war opposition, but one of the things I've begun thinking about for a possible future book is, why did the U.S. enter the war? It had gone on for quite a while, Mm-hmm. Wilson made a point of being neutral, so he got elected on that basis, and all of a sudden, full scale, So something was going on there, and a lot of unanswered questions. And of course, the Russian Revolution arose out of the First World War. Mm-hmm. It's obvious it was a landmark, key moment in world history. And, I think part of it is it's still very secretive. I mean, I live in Scotland, and I can tell you that the British archives are still they still have many documents closed for 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of national security reasons can there be for keeping documents secret for 100 years? But there are a lot of them that are still secret. So that's part of it. It's still very secretive. Wilson was very secretive. He was a very secretive person. He had a strong, he was a historian and academic, and he wanted to go down in history as a certain way. So he was the opposite of transparent. And actually a few surviving documents that say, read this and destroy it right on the document. So he was very secretive, and it's hard to figure out exactly why and when he made key decisions. So I think that's part of it too, is that people it's hard to get a grip on exactly what was going on. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The debates and what was going on, it's very salient to what's happening now. And of course, you said you came out of the Leninist movement, so you know that there was a segment of the left that dwelled on the First World War.
Exactly, yeah. And almost understand everything today as if it's still the First World War. So it's very much the opposite. So.
Perhaps only one segment of the First World War, but still they were very interested in that particular segment. Yeah. But you're right. I think for other parts of the left, of course, I was involved in the Socialist Party, and Debs was still a big hero. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. People knew about Debs, and they knew what Canton speech and all that kind of stuff. So it sort of varies, and I don't think it happened in the U.S., but here during the centenary there was a lot of stuff about the First World War. Unfortunately, most of it was government propaganda, not actually looking at what really happened. Here, it's still a touchy topic. It is a touchy topic. First World War is still a touchy topic, and everybody says my great-grandfather was killed in the trenches, and they don't want to hear about why. I mean, this is a totally stupid, pointless war that went on forever just so the British and the Germans could decide who was the top dog, but they don't want to hear that. Here it's actually still a touchy topic. Not in the U.S., though.
Yeah, I've always wondered, too, that even whenever you see representations of the First World War in the U.S., it's almost depicted as if it has the same moral connotations of World War II. And it's always a bizarre thing because you get the sense that either we don't have enough information, we can't really understand it, but I also think that, it's like this embarrassing and just completely nonsense global, situation of destruction and mass violence and death. And the idea that all of that happened just because of jockeying for power and like trying to carve up the world in this colonialist sort of way, I think it's a lot harder for us to look at that and make sense of it in this simple framework. And I've always wondered if that's why, even now you see depictions of it as if it's like, oh, we were fighting the Nazis, as if it was the same sort of situation.
Right. You're absolutely right. I think it's hard for people to cope with what was going on during the extent of millions of people dying, and people have been talking about the flu epidemic, but of course all that started in World War I.
Exactly.
It started on army bases. It actually started in army bases. That's where the flu first started spreading. So and a lot of people died because they were malnutrition. Their immune system had been compromised. So it had a huge impact, and I think you're right. It's hard for people to come to grips with that, and it's easier to talk about World War II because then it's clear you got the good guys and the bad guys.
Yep.
World War I wasn't like that. All those things are true. So I'm thinking away. So I'll be writing about it.
Well, I was actually curious if that was one of the things that you wanted to focus on in your next book or whatever research you're wanting to do after this.
Well, I got several ideas. One is going to flow directly from this, and that is I'm going to look at the repression of progressives, specifically progressives, that was less in the courts, and they had other ways of trying to deal with that. So that's one idea. But I think I told you, I'm also curious, why did the U.S. enter the war? An interesting question, and one that's very well hidden. I can tell you that because I've started looking at it. And Wilson was not very forthcoming when he made that decision, why he made that decision. And if you raised it, that he had changed his mind, that was a good way to wind up in jail because he didn't want to hear that. So you could quote from Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and in 1917-18, you could get thrown in jail for quoting from what he said. Ridiculous, but true. So that's another idea I have. But I think I found my period. I've learned the basic. I'm going to keep chugging at it.
Well, I'll tell you, it would be really, I think, valuable and I think much needed, especially as, someone on the left today that wants to understand history and is always trying to learn more, to have more people out there on the left writing about this period. Like we've been saying, it's this huge gap, and it seems so crucial to understand. And so again, we can't even really understand why World War II happened unless we thoroughly understand what happened with World War I. So the fact that it's such a gap, I think, is a huge area that we really need to be thinking about. So I'm really glad this is your period. I'm glad you found it.
Well, thanks. When I get the next one done, I'll come on again.
I'd love that. Actually, I think it'd be great to sort of talk more about this. Again, we always want to do areas that aren't really covered by other shows, let alone by just history for people on the left in general. So, Eric, I don't know, is there anything else that you want to cover or anything that we didn't really hit on in the book?
So I think we've sort of done it. People are interested. The books are online, and hope you enjoy them.
Any final comments? Or I'm curious, is there anything that, looking back on it, you wish you would have maybe done more work on or had more time to research? Was there anything that, you kind of were you would sort of change about the book afterward, after it was all said and done?
No, actually, took a long gestation period, so I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do. But of course, there were things coming from it that I wanted to look more at. As I just said, the whole question of progressives, I want to look at more carefully. And here's another thing that I'm so interested in: the surveillance state, which we very much live in. Actually started during World War I. And I want to look more carefully at that, at the kind of surveillance that was going on. Obviously, they didn't have the same kind of electronic means that we have now, but it is sort of spooky, the extent to which they were surveying people and using that information. Now I think it's a little different, but at the time, being gay was woo. So if they found out that you were gay, they used that against you. They threatened you with that exposure, and that carried a lot of implications. Yep. So they weren't surveying for fun. Yeah. They were finding information that they could use against people. That was one of the things. And now I don't think that would have the same kind of impact, but at the time, it did, because most of these people most of the gay men who were active were formally married. You could say, well, anyway. So yeah, I want to look more at that, at the way the surveillance state developed during the First World War.
Well, I'll tell you, I would be very, very excited to be able to read a book about that and the history of the surveillance state, because again, I think sometimes we have this idea that surveillance maybe started around September 11th, but maybe, we might go back to the 60s and 70s, but understanding the longer arc of the 20th century of that. That's history. I have no real understanding of that, but damn, I would love to read more about it. So I hope that book's going to be out soon, because I'll definitely be first on the list to read it.
It takes me a while.
Well, no rush or anything, Eric. Take your time, no pressure. So, it sounds like you got 2 or 3 other books you could be writing at the same time.
Yeah, I try and think of ahead.
Eric, any final closing thoughts? Anything else you want to leave listeners with?
We've done it. It was actually fun. I enjoyed it, and yeah, good luck. I'm sorry that your fellow interviewer wasn't there.
Yeah, me too. So, but I think he's going to really love this episode. And just so you know, some of the things we were talking about throughout the week that we wanted to ask you about, I tried to get those in. So hopefully he was here in spirit, if not in material forms. But, again, I just want to say I am so appreciative of your time, and I really love this conversation. I think our listeners are going to really love this discussion in this area. And, we'll direct them to your book and your other books. And I just want to say thanks. And, just on a really personal note, too, I think a lot of times on the left, especially for folks like my age and younger, we don't have a sense of the history that we're a part of, and so I think being able to talk to you, who has a few years on me, but to understand the continuity and trying to learn from you and understand your history and wisdom, I think is something that I just hold to be really important as someone who's political and on the left today. So I just greatly appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to participate in it. I actually enjoyed it, and when you said that, I was thinking back to the 60s. We like to think of ourselves then as the new left.
Yeah.
But really, we weren't new. We were carrying on a long tradition. Right. And keep that in mind. Important to keep that in mind.
Well, I'm hoping I can maybe say the same thing. We're just trying to carry on the tradition that we're part of. That's maybe a small thing, but a big thing for me, if we can be able to say that. All right, that's a wrap for this week on Red Library. Big shout out, big thanks to Eric T. Chester for joining us, Comrade Eric, with his excellent book, bringing some excellent history, some wisdom from his own anti-war work, his own history of involvement on the left. Again, we're trying to build these linkages across time and space. That is a big part of what we're doing on the show. Trying to put our theory into action or engage in praxis, trademark. Remember, next week, we are not doing a wide release episode, but if you'd like to become a patron, remember, for as little as $1 a month, you can get access to our exclusive episode, which will be out next week. In the meantime, remember, comrades, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated, try not to be deracinated, keep your head on a swivel, especially if you're out there organizing, keep those masks on, know when to say fuck it, mask off, and remember, we out here, your comrades at Red Library. We always out here, but it's also up to you to find the others. They're around. Look for them. Or help create the others by talking to people about politics, by helping to bring icy cold analysis, spicy hot takes into your day-to-day life. Because ideally, this isn't just a podcast. This is designed to be linked up with your actual political day-to-day experience on the ground. But if it is just you for the moment, just know that's what we're here for. That's part of the reason why we have this show. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, Red Library's out of here. We'll see you back soon. Peace.